Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books on some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. During the early 4th century, a controversy arose over the doctrines of Pelagius, Celestius, and Julian of Eclanum. The doctrines in question were not about the Trinity or the Incarnation. Instead, they regarded human nature, freedom, and their relation to grace. Their teachings were opposed by Paulinus of Milan, St. Jerome, but above all, St. Augustine. They were condemned at various regional synods. The Councils of Carthage of 412 and 418, the Council of Diopolis of 415, and 2 councils of African bishops in 416. They were also condemned by Pope Innocent I, Pope Zosimus, and the Council of Ephesus. The controversy helped crystallize the Catholic Church's doctrines on the condition of our first parents, original sin, grace, and conversion. In a certain sense, however, this controversy has never been settled definitively. Similar controversies over the same issues have continued to arise periodically. In this interview, Andrew Chronister discusses Pelagianism and some of the best books on it. Andrew Chronister is Associate Professor of Patristics and Ancient Languages at Kenrick Lenin Seminary. He is the author of Augustine in the Pelagian Controversy, Defending Church Unity. The books discussed in this episode are, first, Answer to the Pelagians, Volume 1, by St. Augustine. 2. The Pelagian Controversy, An Introduction to the Enemies of Grace and the Conspiracy of Lost Souls, by Stuart Squires. 3rd, Religion and Society in the Age of St. Augustine, by Peter Brown. 4th, The Heart of Perfection, How the Saints Taught Me to Trade My Dream of Perfection for God's. And 5th, Augustine in the Pelagian Controversy, Defending Church Unity, by Andrew Chronister. Links to these books are available in the show notes of this episode. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top recommendation on the platform of your choice. Professor Andrew Chronister, welcome.
Thank you.
First of all, what is Pelagianism?
Well, Pelagianism is a heresy that sort of came to the fore in the first couple decades of the 5th century. So it's a very complicated phenomenon, but if we wanted to compress it down to just a little bit of a soundbite, it would be the idea that we have everything that we need in our own human nature and our own faculties to live a good life, to live a life of virtue, and to arrive at heaven. And so it came into conflict with St. Augustine of Hippo in the 410s and 420s, who pushed back strongly against Pelagianism and emphasized the need for grace. It's also attached to notions surrounding the effects of Adam's sin on humanity. So to what extent did Adam's sin cause damage to humanity and to our capacity to avoid sin and things of that sort? So Pelagius, for example, would deny that Adam's sin had any sort of effect on humanity in its very sort of makeup or in our sort of individual capacity to choose the good. And instead that Adam's sin more of just had an effect of providing a bad example to the rest of humanity. So those are sort of two ways in which we can sort of narrow down what exactly Pelagianism is. A rejection of grace and a rejection of original sin.
A later group of authors are referred to by scholars as semi-Pelagians. What's the difference between semi-Pelagians and full-fledged Pelagians?
Right. So, yeah, semi-Pelagianism is sort of a more modern term that we use to refer to certain positions that Augustine wrote against to some extent towards the end of his life. So after he was done sort of debating Pelagius himself, there were a few other individuals that came forward after that. One of them was Julian of Eclanum, so maybe we'll talk about him at some point. But another one were these groups of monks, especially in southern France, who had certain concerns over some of Augustine's views and felt like his views on grace went a little bit too far. And they argued that, yes, grace is important, but we also shouldn't discount the role of human free choice. And so they thought that, okay, yes, we need grace in order to make it to heaven, but we need to make the first step towards God. And so if we make that first step towards God, then God will reward us with grace, the grace that we need to continue our journey. And so Augustine wrote against them, and other writers wrote against them, to basically say, no, even that first step is in need of grace. So God's the one that gets the ball rolling in the process of growth and holiness. It's not us. It's not us making the first step towards God. God is always the initiator in the process of growth and holiness.
Who was Pelagius?
Yeah, so Pelagius, we don't know too much about him biographically. We know he was from Britain originally, and at some point he ended up in Rome. Maybe in the 390s. It's a little bit of a debate among scholars when exactly he showed up in Rome. But we know that he came to prominence in the first decade of the 5th century, so the 400s. And it was there that he developed a following around himself, became known as something of a spiritual guru of sorts, kind of similar to someone like Jerome in some ways, who was known for his ascetic writings and exhortations and moral exhortations and things of that sort. And so we know that around 405, somewhere between 405 and 410, Pelagius wrote a few different works. He wrote some letters. He wrote a work called the De Natura, on nature, in which he sort of outlined his views on grace and the capacity for humanity to avoid sin. It was also during that time period that he wrote his commentary on Paul, the Pauline letters. And that's one of the only works of his that survives in its entirety till today. And so that's kind of where he comes from. He sort of situates himself in this Roman milieu, becomes known as a spiritual leader of sorts, and develops some sort of following about himself, surrounding himself from Roman aristocrats, maybe other sort of, more common folk as well. It's all a little shadowy though, because we don't have a lot of explicit information. So historians have to sort of draw together and piece together different pieces of information from various sources.
And how did the Pelagian controversy start?
Right. So most of the time people will point towards the year 411 as sort of a decisive moment. So in 411, Pelagius's associate, or sometimes he's called his disciple, this guy named Celestius or Caelestius or Caelestius, depending on how you want to pronounce the Latin name. He applies for ordination to the priesthood in Carthage in North Africa. And as a part of that sort of process, he's accused of heresy, and he's brought before a panel of bishops in Carthage, and he's condemned to some extent. And that's what people will often point to as the beginning of the Pelagian controversy, this eruption of controversy in North Africa in 411. And then it just kind of continues after that. Pelagius himself is not all that much sort of explicitly involved at that point in 411, but he will become involved later on as it sort of the controversy expands to Palestine, where Pelagius is again tried for heresy in Palestine in 415. But something I'd like to say is that the controversy actually has its beginnings earlier than that. And we can see this based on the fact of what Pelagius is writing when he's still in Rome before 410. It's clear that even in that Roman context, Pelagius is already doing certain things and saying certain things, and his followers are saying certain things that are making other people upset. Things about grace, or the lack the lack thereof, things about Adam's sin and its effects or non-effects. And so we can see even before all of the controversy begins in North Africa and Augustine himself gets involved, that the Pelagians are already controversial in Rome. And this controversy is kind of, in some ways, imported to Africa from Rome after the sack of Rome in August of 410, where a lot of Roman aristocrats fleeing from Alaric and the Visigoths will travel down to Africa and will continue their sort of theological debates and discussions in Africa. And so it's just, I think that's an important point to draw attention to, just because sometimes people will say, well, it's really just Augustine is the one that's sort of spearheading this whole opposition to Pelagius. But in reality, even before Augustine gets involved, there's controversy surrounding these figures.
And as you mentioned, Pelagius wasn't the only proponent of these doctrinal errors that now go by his name. Some point to an earlier figure called Rufinus the Syrian, this Celestius, and there's also Julian of Eclanum. Did they hold the exact same positions, and what part did they play in the controversy? We've already mentioned Celestius.
Right. Yeah. Well, let me talk about Rufinus the Syrian first. So in more older scholarship, people often point to Rufinus the Syrian as this sort of shadowy figure. We don't really know much about him. But we know from various pieces in surviving evidence that people point to a figure named Rufinus as an important inspiration for Pelagius and Celestius. Celestius, for example, when he's on trial in 411 in Carthage, the people who are accusing him of heresy ask him, well, you're denying that Adam's sin had these effects on human nature and on humanity. Can you, where are you getting this stuff from? And he's like, well, this is actually an open question. There's other good people who hold the same positions that I do. And they're like, well, give us a name. And so he says, well, the priest Celestius, the priest Rufinus, he denies that there's a transmission of Adam's sin to his progeny. And so everyone's sort of like, well, who is this Rufinus guy? For a long time, people just assumed that it was Rufinus of Aquileia, who's Jerome's old friend and formed, turned enemy in the midst of the Origenist controversy. But I'd say in the mid to late 20th century, scholars started pushing back against that a little bit and saying, well, maybe this Rufinus guy is actually someone else. It's this figure named Rufinus the Syrian, that there's other references. So Marius Mercator, who's one of Augustine's allies in the Pelagian controversy, he talks about the origins of Pelagianism. And he says that there's this priest named Rufinus from the province of Palestine, who was a Syrian by birth. This priest Rufinus, who was a Syrian by birth, was the one who sort of taught Pelagius everything that he knew, and then Pelagius was the one who really started to promote it in Rome. There's actually been a lot of work done recently, or in the past 20 or so years, on this by a scholar in Japan named Walter Dunphy, who I think has really convincingly problematized the notion that there is anyone named Rufinus the Syrian, and instead has argued that this Rufinus figure was, as traditionally was presumed, was in fact Rufinus of Aquileia. So that makes sense to me for a whole lot of reasons, although the evidence is in such a state that it's hard to have decisive proof one way or the other. But it seems clear that Rufinus of Aquileia is in the background here. If not the direct inspiration for Pelagianism, he's at least providing a lot of the sort of Eastern texts and earlier Christian texts for a Latin audience that would provide some level of inspiration for someone like Pelagius when he's trying to come up with how to think about these issues like Adam's sin, about sort of grace and free will and things of that sort. So some figure named Rufinus is in the background there.
Celestius. Sorry to interrupt. If it was Rufinus of Aquileia, would it be a case, maybe it was the case that Pelagius or Celestius got the wrong end of the stick from the writings he presented?
Right. It's possible. It's possible. And it's so hard to know what exactly Rufinus himself believed, because so much of what we have from him are simply translations, translations of Origen, translations of other authors. There's relatively little that we have that's just sort of Rufinus telling us what he himself believed. And that's a really interesting question for a whole variety of reasons, right? Because it's hard to know what Rufinus himself believed, but now, most of the works of Origen that we have in translation are thanks to Rufinus's translations. So it becomes a question too of like, what did Origen actually believe, and how do we distinguish Origen and Rufinus? Now, it seems to me unlikely that Rufinus himself was sort of the architect of Pelagianism as we now know it. It seems more likely that he provided inspiration on, certain ways of thinking, perhaps, or certain emphases that then Pelagius and Celestius developed on their own in a more robust way. That's just my sense of things, but again, the evidence is such that it's hard to arrive at sort of decisive conclusions here. If we want to distinguish Pelagius and Celestius a little bit, this is something that's fairly common in scholarship to do, is to sort of say, okay, well, we shouldn't assume that Pelagius and Celestius and Julian of Aclanum all held the exact same positions. It may very well be that their opponents grouped them all together and just assumed that they all held the same views. And I think that's a helpful caution. We shouldn't just assume that they held all the same views. But at the same time, I tend to think that they are closer together than they are different, especially on key issues like grace and free will, and even on issues like original sin. Now, it is fair to say that someone like Pelagius himself says relatively little on the issue of original sin, whereas Celestius seems a lot more interested in that particular topic. And so we'll have more explicit writings from Celestius on that topic, whereas Pelagius is more interested in just basically moral exhortation, exhorting people to live sinlessly, and really emphasizing the capacity of human nature to arrive at that sinless state. Now, Julian's a really interesting figure because it's a little bit unclear to what extent he's actually connected and in communication with Pelagius and Celestius, or if it's just the case that after they're condemned in 418, that Julian sort of steps forward and says, well, I kind of agree with some of the things that they're saying, or maybe I'm a little hesitant to agree with their opponents. And so Julian comes forward as this leader of almost 20 other Italian bishops around 418, and basically refuses to sign on to the condemnation of Pelagius and Celestius. And then he, of course, is a thorn in Augustine's side for the rest of Augustine's life. So again, it's hard to know exactly to what extent Julian fully agrees with everything that Pelagius is teaching. My inclination would be to say that there's a lot more similarity between the two than there is difference on these key issues. But it's fair, at least initially, to sort of entertain the possibility that they're different.
And what were the main 4th century magisterial pronouncements against Pelagianism?
Right. So, key one comes. We of course have various African, local councils that are issuing resolutions and decrees against Pelagianism. Probably the most important of them is 418. There's sort of a Pan-African council that takes place on May 1st of 418 that condemns Pelagianism. Shortly thereafter, a few months after that, we have Pope Zosimus issuing his condemnation of Pelagius and Celestius in a letter called the Tractoria, which unfortunately we only have fragments of now. I guess I should back up and say in January of 417, Zosimus's predecessor, Pope Innocent, had also issued condemnations of Pelagius and Celestius. And so it's all a little murky. What exactly the popes knew about Pelagianism, what exactly they were condemning about it, how strong those condemnations were. Of course, later on we have the Second Synod of Orange, which gets, as I understand it, sort of supported by, or sort of incorporated into the papal magisterium in some way, approved by the papal magisterium, that issues a condemnation of semi-Pelagianism. So those are the sorts of, magisterial sort of teachings that people can point to or look to if they want more information on sort of magisterial teaching on these issues, at least in the patristic period.
And didn't the Council of Ephesus in 431 also condemn Celestius?
Yes. So, and that's a really interesting thing too, because Pelagianism does get condemned, or at least Celestius and I believe Julian too get condemned at Ephesus. But if you look in the actual records of Ephesus, there's very, very little mention of them. So you kind of feel like the people at the Council of Ephesus aren't terribly aware of what Pelagianism is. What's more a problem is the fact that Celestius and Julian have associated themselves with Nestorius. And so it seems like their condemnation comes more so through their connection with Nestorius rather than sort of because the Council of Ephesus itself was terribly concerned about their views. But there's of course a lot of really interesting history there with the whole Council of Ephesus and how Rome is sort of allying with Cyril of Alexandria and all sorts of fascinating stuff there.
Has Pelagianism also flared up again in slightly different forms during subsequent periods?
Yes. I mean, it's always a temptation, right? It's always a temptation to try to overemphasize the human capacity for virtue and, growth in holiness. And I think even in today's world, it's sort of a temptation for many of us. And in part, I'd say it continues to flare up just because these issues are so complicated to get right and so difficult to parse out. Augustine himself has this wonderful quotation in which he says, "It's so difficult to navigate well between the issues of free choice and grace. If you emphasize free choice too much, you seem to undermine grace. If you emphasize grace too much, you seem to undermine free choice." And I'd say even Augustine himself didn't always balance those two things as well as maybe we would have liked him to, especially in some of his last works before his death. And so the controversy itself was sort of resolved to some degree in Augustine's own lifetime with this condemnation of sort of the extreme positions of Pelagius and Celestius. But the exact, how do we navigate this balance of grace and free choice is one that wasn't sort of fully explained in Augustine's lifetime, and so continued to sort of rise up at various points.
And in his commentary on the first chapter of Second Vatican Council's Pastoral Constitution, Gaudium et Spes, Joseph Ratzinger branded its treatment of free will in number 17 as downright Pelagian. Is Pelagianism rife in the modern church?
Well, rife might be too strong of a word. I think that I know, at least in my spiritual life, Pelagianism is always a temptation, right? Or any of us, I think, who are sort of have a tendency towards perfectionism. There's always this sort of inclination to say, well, I just need to do X, Y, and Z, and then I'll sort of grow in holiness, or I just need to accomplish this, this, and this, and then things will be great. And I think something that the witness of Augustine can always call us back to is the need to reflect and to grow in relationship with God and to recognize the divine priority in basically all aspects of our life, right? We have our very existence from God. We have our growth in holiness from God. And that doesn't mean that we're not doing anything. We are really doing something and contributing to that and cooperating with that grace. But if we ever sort of manage to fool ourselves into thinking that we're holy people because of the things that we're doing in and of ourselves, then that's a dangerous road to go down, right? So I think it always remains a danger, just because it's so easy for that pride to start to creep in and for us to start to think that we're really sort of responsible for all of the good things that we're doing and accomplishments that we have.
Although the Council of Carthage of 418 and the Second Council of Orange of 529 helped formulate the Church's teaching against Pelagianism, it's only really with the fourth and fifth sessions of the Council of Trent, with the decrees on original sin and justification, that an ecumenical council articulates these truths of the faith comprehensively. Should we look to Trent for a full understanding of these issues?
I think so. And I think especially Trent's decree on justification, sometimes it's a little bit dangerous just looking back at Augustine himself for the sort of proper response to Pelagianism, because Augustine gets so much right. And of course, he's the doctor of grace. And so we really hold him up as this model for all Catholics. This is a teacher who really recognized the importance of grace and defended it in the midst of controversy. At the same time, there are some of his statements in his later writings, as I already mentioned, that seem to go too far, seem to emphasize grace in such a way that it sounds, and this is anachronistic, it sounds almost Calvinist. It seems sometimes that Augustine speaks in a way that would suggest that grace is irresistible. And that's something that obviously we as Catholics would not want to embrace. And it's something that Trent in the Decree on Justification really makes clear, right? That there's always a possibility to reject grace, right? And so I think that reading Trent on grace is a really helpful way to sort of identify, what did Augustine get right? Where did maybe he go a little bit too far in emphasizing the power of grace? And also, it sort of just gives a beautiful glimpse into the way in which doctrine develops over the course of time, right? And so we have these heroes of the faith, people like Augustine, who do so much good for the faith, but they're not inspired in themselves, right? They're contributing to this gradual unfolding led by the Holy Spirit over the course of centuries to more fully and more deeply understand the full extent of the gospel and the revelation of who God is. And of course, great ecumenical councils like Trent can help us to sort of recognize that and separate the wheat from the chaff, as it were, of the centuries.
That brings us to the first book, which collects and translates 7 of Augustine's anti-Pelagian writings. What advice would you give on reading this book? Or which of these treatises are the most important? There's 7 of them. Right.
Yes. So it's a nice thick book. So it'll keep people engaged for quite a period of time. These are the works that especially come from the first stage of the Pelagian controversy. So between 411 and 418. And these are the ones that are written specifically against Pelagius himself or Celestius. Whereas some of the later anti-Pelagian works are directed more so against Julian of Eclanum or the semi-Pelagians. I think that this work is really helpful because, there's a lot of really solid stuff in here from Augustine. I'd say if you want just a really good primer on Augustine's view of grace, that's really not as concerned with undermining Pelagianism, but more with positively presenting his views on grace and how to understand its relationship with free will. On the Spirit and the Letter is a really good one to read. It's relatively short and not too complicated to get through. That's a fairly early work from about 412-ish. And it's a good one to look at. just because he has a lot of careful and precise language in there. If you're looking for one that's maybe tackling more what Pelagius thought and how Augustine is sort of responding to Pelagius, a good one that I like to look at with my students sometimes is On the Grace of Christ and Original Sin. So this is from the summer of 418. So it has 2 books in it. The first one deals with grace, and the second one deals with original sin. And there, Augustine's providing a lot of quotations from Pelagius's writings and also from Celestius's writings to basically show, hey, here's what they really think, and here's why they're wrong. And it's really interesting, too, to read because you can tell that Pelagius, sometimes a caricature of Pelagius is given that he's just rejecting grace. He hates grace, and he says, we don't need grace at all. And it's clear that that's not what Pelagius actually thought. Pelagius did think that we need grace, and said sometimes that we need grace for every moment and for every action. So the real question is, what does Pelagius mean by grace? Does he mean the same thing that Augustine means by grace? Of course, the answer is no, he does not mean the same thing. But Augustine does a really good job in that work of sort of parsing out the difference between their views and explaining why he thinks Pelagius is wrong.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.